Okay, so this is chapter 26, Facing Mr. Derby. Black baby, white mama, big trouble, Amari said with fear tightening her face as carefully as she washed the child and wrapped her in a blanket. Polly's jumbled thoughts careened from how this could have happened. Rape, perhaps? To how Mr. Derby would react. Uncontrollable rage, to be sure. To how she felt about the proper white woman producing a black baby. Mild disgust at the very least. What should we do? Polly asked, almost panicked. Tell Mr. Derby? See, this mild disgust part, Polly's just starting to come around to the idea that, hey, Africans are people too. Just because their skin is dark doesn't mean that they're animalistic or robotic or ew, but she's not completely there. So the thought of a white person and a black person loving each other and having a baby together still disgusts her, which is not cool. That's obviously not cool, but it tells us that she's not completely come around yet. She is closer to that idea of equality between black and white than most of the other people in the novel, but not completely. No, Amari cried, alarm in her voice. Get Teeny, hurry, hurry. Polly rushed out of the room, praying that she would not encounter Clay or Mr. Derby as she ran to the kitchen. Teeny, she screamed when she got there. Come quickly, we don't know what to do. Is the child born yet? Teeny asked as she ran with Polly back to the house. Yeah, the baby is fine and healthy, Polly said, panting. It's a little girl. Oh, do it look like Miss Derby, all pink and perfect? The child is not what anyone expected, Teeny. Well, what do you mean, Chow? Is Miss Isabel ailing? No, she's sleeping. She doesn't know yet. Know what? You ain't making no sense, Polly. By that time, they had reached Miss Isabel's room. Amari was sitting in a chair with the baby in her arms, cuddling it close to her. Teeny stared at the baby in shock. Oh, Lord, 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 Teeny exclaimed as she sucked in her breath. It be Noah, she announced with finality. No wonder everybody be scarce as hen's teeth today. Noah, Polly thought. Noah, of course. It all makes sense now. But how could she? Why would she? Polly's stomach churned as she tried to figure out the magnitude of the problem. At that moment, Mrs. Derby opened her eyes. She looked around with fear. My baby? She asked desperately. Well, you got a pretty little girl child, Miss Isabel. But you got a big problem, ma'am, Teeny told her with concern in her voice. May I see her? Amari placed that sleeping baby in her mother's arms. Mrs. Derby gazed down at the child, her eyes brimming with tears. My beautiful baby, she murmured over and over. Finally calmer, she looked up at Teeny and the girls. I must explain, she whispered, before I die. Well, you ain't gonna die, Miss Isabel, Teeny assured her. You is fit and fine. Everybody feels a little poorly after having a baby. Tenderly, Mrs. Derby touched the infant's velvety brown face. You don't understand. My husband will kill me, she said with certainty. He adore you, ma'am, Teeny said reasonably. Anybody who look at him can see that. He ain't gonna hurt you. Mrs. Derby blinked back tears. Even though he married me for my money, I know he really has come to feel real love and affection for me. But I love Noah. I have for many years, and he loves me too. But now Noah will die, and so will I. My husband is going to kill us both and our baby. Well, he would never do such a thing. But Teeny knew that Mr. Derby was probably quite capable of murder, and that would be within the limits of social acceptability to do this for impropriety. Her mind was reeling. So that's important. What Teeny is saying here, we're inside Teeny's head. It would be perfectly socially acceptable. Nobody would say anything if at this point Mr. Derby literally murdered his wife, white, Noah, black, but his property, and this baby that's been produced. So think about that, folks. A time in America when nobody would blink an eye for a man to kill an innocent 18-year-old woman who was basically forced into a marriage A man, Noah, who, by the way, is around the same age as Isabel. You don't know that. You haven't been told that yet, but he is. And a baby, a sweet, innocent baby who's only hours, minutes old. That was once the very country that we live in. What to do? Amari asked in a whisper. What should we tell him, ma'am? Polly asked. Mrs. Derby pushed herself up into a sitting position. She suddenly looked excited. I know. Tell him the baby died. Tell him it was a stillbirth. You must take my baby away to safety. Here, take her, she urged them. She lifted the baby up, but when Amari reached for the child, Mrs. Derby drew the child close to her chest once more. He's going to want to see the baby's body, ma'am, Teeny tried to reason. Tell him it was deformed. A monster. Tell him anything. Just keep my baby safe. She kissed her daughter gently and snuggled her closer. We best be getting you cleaned up before the massa get back. He only went to the next plantation, Teeny declared. I got a bad feeling about this. We go all hang before nightfall, she muttered. Lord, 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 what we gonna do? We done fell out of the trouble tree and we hit every branch on the way down. Polly, Amari, and Teeny moved quickly to help Mrs. Derby get cleaned up and ready to face her husband. The baby nursed peacefully at her mother's breast, her cocoa-brown skin a sharp contrast on Mrs. Derby's pinkness. Mrs. Derby patted the baby, held her close as she slept, and brushed away tears. Finally, she handed the infant to Amari. Protect her, she said simply. Amari blinked to keep away her own tears and took the baby with great seriousness. Polly watched as Amari held the perfect little infant close to her breast. We must go now, Mrs., Teeny said with quiet alarm. Mrs. Derby nodded with sad resignation as Polly, Amari, and Teeny left with the baby. As they crept down the steps, Teeny whispered to Amari, Sarah Jane just born a baby about 3 months ago. She got lots of milk. That's where we'll hide her for now. They tiptoed down the hall. Only Polly noticed Clay through a window as he approached the other side of the house. She signaled for Amari and Teeny to be still. He seemed to be looking in the other direction. She prayed that they had arrived back home and had not seen anything. When they heard him enter the back of the house, they exited quickly through the front of the house. Tidbit, Teeny called as they reached the kitchen. The sleepy boy and his dog jumped from the pallet they had shared near the fireplace. Take Mina and Polly down the corridors to Jubal and Sarah Jane's place, and don't ask no questions. The child looked at his mother's frightened face and seemed to realize this was no time for foolishness. Teeny told Polly, don't tell her nothing, except this baby's mama is dead and she's got to nurse it. Of course, don't take no genius to figure out whose the baby this be. Lord, what a mess. Hurry. Amari and Polly dashed out after Tidbit, Amari clutching the child close to her. Baby be safe with Sarah Jane? She asked Polly. Well, we have no choice. The baby's life is at stake, Polly replied, trying to sound hopeful. Sarah Jane's large, loving arms took the baby girl with no question. She be fine, child, Sarah Jane said to Amari. Sarah Jane will keep this little one safe. Now y'all get back to the kitchen. Tonight be full of danger. Polly shivered as they hurried to Teeny's kitchen. Will this work? As soon as they got back, Teeny told her, get on up to the house and see Miss Isabel. Polly, Amari, you stay here with me. I got a supper to fix. She began pulling down pots noisily, mumbling, maybe praying to herself, Polly figured. She hurried off to the main house. Polly had just made sure that Mrs. Derby's hair was brushed and that she had on a fresh dressing gown when Mr. Derby returned. Polly heard him rush up the stairs. She braced herself. He burst into the room where he found his wife fast asleep. Polly sitting in a chair next to her, pretending to be weeping. Her heart thudded in her chest. She prayed that she could convince him. Where is the baby? Mr. Derby demanded. He looked around in confusion. Polly's eyes, full of honest fear, told him sadly. The baby was stillborn, sir. I'm so sorry, but your wife is fine, she added. What? He took a few steps back. It died? He raked his fingers through his hair. His face seemed to crumple. Was it a boy or a girl? He asked, barely able to choke out the words. A girl, sir. Well, I want to see her. I want to see my baby. His voice broke. Oh, no, you don't want to do that, sir, Polly said, stammering a little. The child was, not normal. It's better to bury it quickly. Anguish ripped at Mr. Derby's face. "Don't you try to tell me what I want to do. Bring me the baby of my daughter." He blinked furiously, but Polly could see the tears in his eyes. She didn't know what to do. At that moment, his wife's eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused for a moment, and then she saw her husband. She said with a sob, "The baby never took a breath, Percival. I'm so sorry." "Are you all right, my darling?" Mr. Derby asked her gently as he leaned over to her. She reached up and touched her face. "I am fine." "Did you see her, our daughter?" he asked. Mrs. Derby hesitated. "Yes, I did. She was deformed." She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. Polly was impressed with how effective she was. Mr. Derby narrowed his eyes. "Something doesn't make sense here," he said suspiciously. He paced the room and looked at Polly sharply. "I prayed every day for this baby," Mrs. Derby whispered. That much Polly knew was very true. "I couldn't have fathered an imperfect child," Mr. Derby declared. He seemed agitated. "I must see her, if nothing else, to say goodbye." Mrs. Derby spoke up frantically. "I instructed the servants to wrap her and bury her far away from our house." "Nonsense! Our daughter, regardless of any infirmary, must be buried with honor in the family plot," he told her. "How dare you discard my child like that?" He scolded, anger and sorrow lacing his voice. Polly found herself feeling sorry for the man. "I'm so sorry, Percival," Mrs. Derby whispered again. "Please do not bring her into my presence again. Just thinking of her is more than I can bear." Polly thought that she looked more terrified than sorrowful. He leaned over and kissed his wife on the forehead. "I share in your grief, my dear," he said to her. "You rest for now, and I will take care of these unpleasant details." As soon as he was leaving the room, he said to Polly, Bring me the body of my daughter. When the doctor gets here with Noah, he will want to examine her." Polly curtsied, and then she slammed the door behind him. Mrs. Derby whispered to Polly, "Is my baby safe?" "Yes, ma'am," Polly replied. "For now. But when the doctor gets here, we have to show him something." "Well, perhaps the doctor can be delayed," Mrs. Derby suggested. "Can you get word to Noah before they return?" "I'm not sure, ma'am. We be all right for a while. I must check with Teeny and see what can be done." "Well, yes, of course. Please, go and do what you must. You move beyond kindness to help us. I shall forever be grateful." Polly hurried down the stairs and into the kitchen, desperate to avert a tragedy. How has it come to this? She thought. She realized then how deeply her life was entangled with those of the slaves that she had once so despised. So, the big question at the end of this chapter we have to ask, did Clay see these people? Because if Clay saw the girls with the baby and Teeny, then we're in big trouble. Because not only have we tried to pull the wool over Mr. Derby's eyes, but we've lied to him too, which is twice as bad. That's a big question. Secondly, we come back to Mr. Derby's arrogance and his cockiness, his being overly confident in this moment when he says that there is no way that he could have ever produced an imperfect child. I think this really goes to show who Mr. Derby is. In all of this moment, he is sad. He's got tears in his eyes, but he's also really, really just coming back to that jerk personality that we have known of him since the beginning of the novel. He's been rude and mean and awful and terrible since we first saw him when he was purchasing Amari, and he's still deep down that same person. I can understand a part of him wanting to see the baby for closure. That's why we have funerals and things like that as humans. But the fact that he makes the comment that he could have never produced an imperfect child just goes right along with his personality. In this moment, he could have done anything. He could have stayed in bed and hugged his wife. He could have broke down and cried in the corner. He could have got on his knees and prayed to God. He could have done anything. But in this moment, he says, he still goes back to his jerkishly ways and says, "No way." Because that's who Mr. Derby is. And ultimately, that's who Clay is too, as we saw in Gator Bait when he used poor Tidbit literally as bait for an alligator. I mean, who could use a little 3-year-old, 4-year-old little baby to do that? I just don't know. And now we've got this situation where they're looking for the baby, and although the plantation is large, the slave quarters area is all in one area. So this is going to be nearly impossible to hide. If there's a crying baby, it will be found. Of course, a slave could say that it was anybody's baby, but there's a big difference between a baby that was had a couple weeks ago versus a baby that was had a couple of hours ago. I don't know if they're going to get away from this one.